User data. We all create it, but few of us understand how it's used. Join me on a journey to understand web policy, determine what our data is worth, and uncover how we just might be able to control its use in the next web. Really appreciate you being here today to join this conversation around user data and how it's used today, but also how it may be used and some policies that we could look at for the future web. I'm a big fan of the content you're creating, your organization, the Sortition Foundation, and your book, The End of Politicians. Just to kind of give our audience a little bit of a background, could you tell us, your story and where you come from and your experience?
Sure. Thanks, Frank. It's great to be here. I'm the founder and director of the Sortition Foundation. We promote the use of citizens' assemblies in political decision making, essentially, and that's also the subject of the book, The End of Politicians. It uses sortition, which is the technical name for lottery, and deliberation to come to informed decisions about political policy issues, essentially.
Super interesting. Yeah, I have to say, reading through that book, it was very well presented, the ideas around this idea of sortition and how it's used or has been used in the past and is continuing to be used in some forms today around decision making. Could you describe some of the challenges currently in the current government systems that you're involved with, trying to create interest in the use of this system, and how you might see that it could be potentially used today in our world?
Yeah, for sure. So citizens' assemblies as such have seen a massive kind of spike in use, specifically in Europe, where we've seen a lot of local citizens' assemblies, and now we're seeing some national level citizens' assemblies. So President Macron has held one in France and has promised to hold another one. In Ireland, they've now held, I think, 4 or 5 citizens' assemblies on quite a wide variety of topics. There's a citizens' assembly in Spain, a citizens' assembly in Austria. Germany is showing quite a bit of interest, as well as Scotland as well. The main problem with citizens' assemblies at the moment is that they're still just advisory. So governments ask for these things to happen. We select by lottery a group of people that represents the community of relevance, bring them together to go through this informed deliberative process. They come up with these great recommendations, which are all kind of sensible and reasonable and people typically trust. They give those to governments, and governments choose whether to implement them or not. So what we're actually campaigning for as an organization is to institutionalize these bodies, to actually make them like part of the political system. For example, have a second chamber in the parliament. It could have a citizen senate, so that actually their recommendations have to be listened to. So there is a massive sort of spike in use of them, especially in Europe, but also quite a few in Canada. And that the main thing is, how do we give them teeth, so to speak?
Super interesting. And I realize you come into this conversation kind of in a bit of a separate area of expertise. Part of this discussion that we're having with a number of individuals like yourself is, how can we look today to use what we're used to in politics and systems with regulators to enact some better policy when it comes to the use of user data and the next web, such as Web3 and the metaverse. As we move towards this Web3 and beyond, how might a global citizens' assembly be used in your mind to help keep corporations accountable for the use of our data?
So we did run an interesting experiment before the climate change conference in Glasgow last year, where we supported some organizations to recruit for a global citizens' assembly. So we brought together a representative sample of the globe. In this sort of pilot study, there was 100 people, but you could imagine that being 500 or 1,000. And we brought them together to go through this process of deliberation on climate change, very complex topic with lots of trade-offs, etc. I could see a very similar thing happening about global corporate governance, where that would fit into a global governance system. This is, as you say, that's sort of beyond my areas of expertise. Would it be attached to the UN? Would it be attached to the WTO? This is where I could see good examples of that of it fitting in. For example, the WTO proposes some kind of trade treaty that regulates global corporate transactions or something, and that goes through a global citizens' assembly process to see what everyday people think about that proposal before it actually gets voted on by nation states or something. That would be, those kind of forums, I think, are where it'd be naturally suited. I do know that the United Nations Environment Program is, I think, in conversation with the Global Assembly people about using this as a tool regularly in environment policy at a global level. So I can't see any reason why that couldn't also be shifted across to corporate governance.
Yeah, that's some really interesting thought there. And in the example that you gave, have you noticed any challenges with trying to organize a global assembly?
Yeah, massive challenges. It's really hard. What we actually did on the ground is we randomly selected 100 points on the globe weighted by population density. So that meant that like 15 of those points are in China, 15 of those points are in India. Then we tried to find community organizations near those points to recruit people on the street at more or less that sort of latitude and longitude. Oh. This was, a massive challenge to find community organizations in 100 different countries across the globe. Of course, then you also have the challenge to actually get those people together, which we did online, just given the different time zones, of course, and the different languages. So each person was accompanied by a translator, of course, so that they could communicate, and that translator was translating into English or Spanish or Chinese, whatever the key languages were. And so, those logistic challenges were immense. And then bringing them actually together online was just a challenge for the time zone. If you want to bring them together in person, of course, then it's just a cost challenge. It might, in the end, though, be a positive trade-off to try to bring those people together. Of course, we try to reduce all the barriers to participation. So there's also, when it was online, there was massive barriers about people actually just, in some countries, getting a computer, having a good internet access. Typically, the people were paid for their time to participate. So if people had to give up work hours to participate, they got some compensation, etc. So beyond the sort of logistical challenges and the sort of cultural linguistic challenges, if you can get through those, then it was a really meaningful and really empowering experience for those people. And the proposals they came up with were really well thought out, considered, reasonable. So this sort of pilot study we did, to us, proved it can be done. If there's the political will and the finances, it can definitely be done.
Wow. Yeah, I can only imagine the challenges that would be posed with that. But what a unique way of sorting, a demographic across the globe. And certainly today, with us being used to being in front of screens more than ever because of current conditions that we've all been experiencing, it's certainly encouraging to hear that there are some systems and exercises that you're currently conducting to see how these important discussions can be had with the many as opposed to the few.
Yep.
So most privacy policies we see today and terms of use are typically written by lawyers, and they have the client's best interest in mind. How do you feel sortition might play a part in a solution to the drafting of these policies that we're all, in many ways just accepting without diving too deep into, that would allow us to better understand what we're agreeing to?
Yeah, again, it's not my area of expertise as well. I mean, looking at the EU example, which I'm sure you know well as well, the GDPR legislation that requires that these sort of policies that everyone's agreeing to are written in clear and plain language. I think if you had such a law that they have to be written in clear and plain language, a sortition body could sort of give that tick of approval or something. You could put it to a group of everyday people who go through this thing and say, yes, this is actually understandable by a representative sample of the community that you're applying it to. I mean, what sortition and the sort of citizens assembly thing does well is it gives you this sort of microcosm that simulates how the whole society would react given a sort of the ability and the time to actually look at things in detail. So I can also see that could be used to actually a sortition body may have to approve this before these things can go public. Although, I mean, given the number of different privacy policies for every corporation has their own little tweaks, I don't know how that would actually work in practice, other than if a government had to set, these are the standard conditions that must be as a basis of every policy, and the sortition body got a chance to deliberate on those and recommend changes. That would potentially be another way.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thought as well on how that could be looked at. I think in some of the discussions we've been having with a number of individuals is that there just doesn't seem to be enough people at the table when it comes to making the decisions around not only data and how it's handled and collected, but also that the person that's agreeing to share that information is understanding of what they're accepting. One point that really kind of stuck out for me with your organization and your book is just, as you mentioned, drafting things in layman terms and ensuring that there is that general understanding as opposed to a written word that covers all bases in the event of any possible scenario. I think is one that could certainly be not only drafted and reviewed by a potential sortition body, as you suggest, but would be a very interesting way of going about it. Not to mention, I can completely agree that the task of multiple assessments of multiple policies could be a difficult one. There's been some conversation we've had that the introduction of a pictogram system could be really adopted, so that a quick visual reference for that visitor to a platform or a website can understand based off of that pictogram what information is going to be collected on them.
Yeah, interesting. I think a lot of the research onto citizens' assemblies and sortition events is that typically people trust the outcomes of those groups of people more than, for example, they trust a group of politicians, because they assume that they're looking out for the greater good and not just following vested and factional interests. So I wonder if there could be a kind of stamp of approval that someone's privacy policy had gone through an assembly process where ordinary everyday people read it, understood it, and went, yeah, this is a reasonable kind of policy. And that would also give people that level of trust that it's not only in the interests of the corporations themselves. Just as an idea that,
Yeah, and we see that currently in these B certified corporations, that there's that stamp of approval that they've gone through a certain process to be recognized. So that's certainly a very interesting thought as well, and one that could be developed further. One thing I realized here, just as we're getting close to the end of our interview, is that some might not be familiar with what sortition is. Would you be able to provide a quick example or a quick explanation, I should say, of what sortition is?
Yeah, the simplest answer is that sortition is the technical name for selection by lottery. So instead of bringing people together who have won elections to talk about whatever topic, it's the same principle as is used in a legal jury, for example. You select a bunch by lottery of people, you bring them together. In theory, it's a sort of representative microcosm of the society or community you're dealing with. And that and then you put them through this informed deliberative process. Whereas a legal jury is pronouncing on sort of a legal opinion, what these citizens' assemblies do is they basically bring people together to pronounce on sort of policy issues, essentially. So yeah, sortition just means lottery, essentially.
Okay, that's great.
Cheers.
Well, just in closing, is there anything else you feel you'd like to add to this conversation today, or anything else that our listeners or viewers should go to explore if they're interested in learning more about sortition?
I mean, definitely come and visit our website at sortitionfoundation.org. Of course, you can grab my book, End of Politicians, available. All good books are sold. We, of course, are on Facebook, on Twitter, at Sortition Now, if you like to follow and get more information about what we are doing. The Global Assembly I mentioned is at globalassembly.org. Very interesting pilot experiment. Hopefully we see more of those happening in the future, and hopefully we see more of them happening on diverse topics such as data and privacy.
That's great. Well, Brett, thanks very much again for your time today. I greatly appreciate you coming to the conversation. I feel like you've had a lot of good insight to share, and would highly recommend those interested to continue to follow you or visit the sites as mentioned. So thank you very much again for your time today.
Cheers. Thank you.